Good to see you all. Thank you so much for being here. We are now in the heart of Christmas. It's less than a week away. Actually, I read an article this week. It was really interesting. It's a couple years old, so the information could be out of date. But I always assumed that Black Friday was the busiest shopping day of the year. But according to this article, as of 2 years ago, the Friday and Saturday before Christmas are the two busiest shopping days of the year. So the good news is you're through those. So if you still need to get some Christmas presents, it should be a little less crowded now than it was this last weekend. But we're in the heart of it. Everybody's getting their gifts, doing everything finalized, doing all the cooking, doing all the preparations. This is, to me, this is the exciting time of Christmas. You're leading right up to it. My daughter actually asked my wife and I this deeply philosophical question the other day. She looked at us in all seriousness and she goes, "Mom, Dad, do you like December 24th better or December 26th better?" It's do you like right before Christmas or do you like, and I was puzzled. People ask those deep questions of life, and I thought, that's a great question. My answer was that I liked the 24th because I like the excitement that leads up to Christmas. It's just before Christmas, and I remember as a kid, you have all this anticipation and all this excitement and all these cool things. But what's interesting is when you look back, historically at Christmas and the way Christmas has been celebrated, particularly in what we know as the Western world, people haven't always had that excitement about Christmas and about the Christmas season. I actually learned something interesting about the history of Christmas, particularly in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts colony. So years ago in the 16th and 17th century, there was a group in England, a group of Protestant Christians in England that felt like the Church of England had been essentially corrupted by a lot of the Catholic influence. And so their whole goal was, hey, let's get this Catholic influence out of the Church of England. This group, you may be familiar with them, is known as Puritans. And the whole thing with the Puritan movement was, hey, let's purify the church, let's purify Christianity from all these things that we don't think are a part of Christianity. Now, Puritans were the group that actually came over from England and settled in what at the time was the Massachusetts colony and kind of settled that whole area. Now, Puritans back in England ended up leading a revolt in 1647 against King Charles I. And after they had him beheaded and kind of tried to set up a new whole system and society, one of the things they did was to actually ban Christmas. They had a law on the books that you were not allowed to celebrate Christmas. Now, 12 years later, in 1659, in Massachusetts, the Puritans who had come over and settled there actually followed suit with their counterparts over across the pond, and they outlawed Christmas. So there was a law on the books in Massachusetts that Christmas was forbidden. You couldn't celebrate it. And the Puritans, if you look at it, they actually had solid reasons for why they outlined it or why they outlawed it. And part of their reason was theological, and part of their reason was practical. So from the theological perspective, the first thing the Puritans looked at is they said, well, there's nothing about Christmas in the Bible. If you read through the New Testament, which is the second part of the Bible, it talks about the birth of Jesus, and even within the early church, Jesus never commands anybody to celebrate Christmas. The early church never really celebrated Christmas. So there's not a biblical precedent for it. So the Puritans looked at it and said, it's not even really a biblical holiday. Now the second part, and I would say probably their bigger theological objection to it, is the reason that we celebrate Christmas at the time of year that we do, December 25th, kind of at the end of this year, more than likely goes back to the Roman Empire. And this time of year, there was a pagan festival, it was Saturnalia, and then they had this Day of the Sun God. And so it was this big, epic pagan festival that was full of all kinds of debauchery. And so more than likely what happens is as the Roman Empire becomes more and more Christian, they end up really co-opting that holiday and saying, well, we don't worship these pagan gods anymore, but we like the holiday, so let's get rid of the pagan gods and let's put Jesus in there. And so Christmas, the time that we celebrate it in, and to some extent the way that we celebrate it, is rooted in this pagan festival that the Puritans wanted nothing to do with. So from a theological perspective, they're it's not in the Bible, it has these pagan roots, we don't want anything to do with it. Now from a practical standpoint, the reason that they wanted to ban Christmas and made it a criminal offense to celebrate Christmas had to do with the fact that in the 16th and 17th century, Christmas was kind of a holiday season that was known for its debauchery. We tend to think of Christmas as it's this wholesome family holiday, and you do good things, and you gather with the family, and you have turkey, and it's all fun. But in the 16th and 17th century, it was a time that was known for drinking and gambling and all kinds of illicit behavior. There was a clergyman, a 16th century clergyman whose name was Hugh Latimer, and here's what he wrote. This is his exact quote. He said, "Men dishonor Christ more in the 12 days of Christmas than in all the 12 months besides." And so the Puritans are looking at it going, okay, here's this thing that we don't even agree with from a religious perspective, but then when you look at it practically, it's like horrible. There's this drinking and gambling and all this bad behavior. So for these reasons, this is why they ended up outlawing it. And they made it in Massachusetts a criminal offense. Now, from what we can tell, the law was never really enforced, and that they would like come to your house and knock on your door and drag you and your family into jail. But it was just more kind of like a shunned thing to do, like you didn't do it. So people would still celebrate Christmas, but like in private. Like, let's set up a Christmas tree in our closet, we'll close the door and no one can see. And so we may do things in our home, but it wasn't this big public thing. Now, in England, the ban on Christmas only lasted for like 13 years because they lifted it in 1660. But in Massachusetts, that law stayed on the books for another 21 years. And so they didn't lift it until 1681. So if you look at it in terms of years, essentially there was a whole generation that grew up where Christmas was outlawed and it was banned and you couldn't do it. And what's funny is even after 1681, even when they took the law off the books, it was still like frowned upon if you celebrated Christmas. Like if you were in Massachusetts, it wasn't technically illegal, but like if people saw, you're putting up a tree. You're one of those people. You celebrate Christmas. It was still highly looked down upon. In fact, Christmas wasn't even declared a national holiday, or an official holiday in Massachusetts until 1856. That's when they determined this is a public holiday. And so it's interesting when you look back on Christmas, and when I talk about Christmas, I mean Christmas the way that we celebrate it, like in our culture, and again, what's known as the Western world. Because the way we celebrate it, the time of the year that we celebrate it, like I said, goes all the way back to the Roman Empire. The first record we have of actually celebrating Christmas on December 25th comes from the year, I believe it was 336. So 330 years after Jesus, that's, kind of coincides with that whole festival thing. And so that's why Christmas is when it is. That's why kind of we celebrate it the way that we do. And so when you look at the history of Christmas, on the day that we celebrate it, the way that we celebrate it, kind of the cultural thing that it is, people have had different responses to that. Some people have enjoyed celebrating it. Some people don't like to celebrate it. And a lot of times we tend to think of, well, because it's like a religious holiday in its nature, that religious people celebrate it, and if anyone's against it, they're not religious. Well, again, what's funny is go back to the Puritans. You cannot be any more religious than the Puritans. They are like super, ultra, mega religious. And they still opposed it for those various reasons. And so you have people who, as you approach Christmas, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, even as you approach Christmas now, there's people that respond to it in different ways. And there's people that react to it in different ways. We've spent the last 2 weeks kind of talking about really what I would say is the core of Christmas. Christmas is ultimately this holiday that celebrates the birth of Jesus. And so we've been talking about Jesus and the baby Jesus. And we talked a couple weeks ago about who he was. In his nature, John, in the beginning of his account of the life of Jesus, talks about him as, this is God in the flesh. Like the substance behind all of the universe is present in the person of Jesus. And then last week we talked about why did he come? Like, okay, he's God in the flesh, but why was he even here? And God came down in the person of Jesus, essentially, simplistically, to make everything right. That the biblical story is that the creation is not as it should be, but God is setting it all right in the person of Jesus. So we've spent these last 2 weeks kind of talking about Jesus and the essence of Christmas and why Christmas matters and why Christmas is even important. But what I want to do this week, as we're here just a few days out from Christmas, is I want to talk about what should our response be to Christmas. Okay, if God came down in the person of Jesus and he came down in order to set everything right, how should we respond to that? And here's the point I want to make. We have 4 books in the New Testament that we call Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are the 4 books that tell us about the life of Jesus. And 2 of our Gospel writers, Matthew and John, they're like eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. They're what's known as the 12 or the apostles, like Jesus' closest friends, his inner circle. And so they write these like firsthand accounts of, hey, here's what I saw, here's what I experienced. I watched him die, and then a few days later, he cooked breakfast for me on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. So they're like these eyewitness firsthand accounts. Then you have Luke and Mark, who are friends with some of the apostles. Luke talks about how he went around and did all of this investigation and interviewed all these eyewitnesses, and they're saying, here's what we found. So what we call the Gospels, these are these firsthand eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. But The gospel writers didn't just write what they wrote in those books so that we would have a historical record. Yes, they wanted us to understand something. Yes, they wanted us to know what it is they saw and they experienced, but they also wanted us to do something. It wasn't just, hey, here's this information, now that you have it, do what you want with it. They wrote with an intention. They wanted us, when we read it, to do something. Luke actually is the one who tells us the most about the birth of Jesus. Luke actually begins his gospel by saying, hey, here's why I wrote this. And John, if you read John, not the very end of John, but close to the end, there's a paragraph in John where you'll read where John will say, hey, here's why I wrote all this down. That the Gospels aren't just there for, hey, here's this information, now you have it. It's, yes, here's this information, here's this historical record, but here's what I want you to do. That the Gospel writers actually want us to do something in response to the story of Jesus. And so what I want to look at today is, what is it that they want us to do in response to the birth of Jesus? Yes, we have the story and we have all this information, but what is it that the gospel writers are actually advocating for us to do? What should our response be to this story about the birth of Jesus and to Christmas? And to kind of answer this question, to kind of wrestle through this question, I want to focus in on the shepherds. And if you're familiar with the story of the birth of Jesus at all, you know that the shepherds kind of play this pivotal role. If you have in your house a nativity scene, or if you drive by someone on your street, they have a nativity scene outside, you know that the nativity scene is kind of this picture of the birth of Jesus. And in the middle, you always have Mary and Joseph, and Jesus is right there. And on one side, typically, you have the wise men who brought their gifts, and on the other side, you have the shepherds. And the shepherds are there, and they have their sheep, and these are all kind of the characters that make up the Christmas story. And I want to look real quick at the shepherds, because the shepherds play really a pivotal role. And I think in a lot of ways, the shepherds are the key for us understanding how the gospel writers want us to respond to the story of Christmas. Jesus is born in really a village called Bethlehem, which is this little village outside of the city of Jerusalem. And that Jerusalem is in what you and I know as Israel and the Palestinian territories. And so when Jesus is born in kind of this little rural area of Bethlehem, we're told, Luke tells us in his account of the life of Jesus, in his gospel, that there are shepherds that are out in the fields nearby. Here's what Luke says in Luke 2:8. He writes, and there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. So not far from where Jesus is born, you have these shepherds. Now Israel, like as a nation, if you go back into their history, like shepherding was a part of who they were. Like some of the great people in Israel's past, like King David, for example, was a shepherd. But even like the great history that shepherding has within Israel, and even though they had been a shepherding people for a long time, the world that Jesus is born into, like shepherds are not like noble people that are respected. This isn't like a profession that people want to go into, that a career day at school, we have a bunch of kids like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a shepherd. They were looked down upon. They were social outcasts. In a lot of ways, they were religiously unclean. They weren't allowed to go into the temple to worship. They were kind of misfits. And so the fact that the shepherds even play a part at all in the story of the birth of Jesus is pretty incredible. Because here's Luke telling us God is becoming flesh, and he's entering the world as a human being, and the first people that are a part of it are these kind of lowly, outcast, looked down upon, dirty, smelly shepherds. They're the first ones, the first people to hear about the birth of Jesus. As these shepherds are out in the field doing their job, shepherding, keeping watch over their flock, this angel, this messenger appears to them and announces to them really what is happening. And here's what the angel says, Luke 2, verse 10. Do not be afraid, the angel says. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. So this messenger shows up, and the messenger says, I bring you good news. The New Testament is originally written in Greek, and in Greek, the word good news is the word euangelion, which is where we get our word evangelism. Evangelism is a direct translation of that. Actually, there's another word that we use a lot too that you may be familiar with. It's the word gospel. Gospel's, again, what we use to describe the books that tell us about Jesus, but if you've ever been a part of a church, you've probably heard people say, hey, the gospel, or I'm not talking about the gospel, or the gospel. Gospel actually comes from a Latin word that means good story, but that Latin word is translated from this Greek word. So in English, our words gospel, evangelism, evangelical, all that stuff, they all come from this root Greek word that means good news. Now, the Greeks used that word when they were going to announce particularly a military victory. So if you were at war with someone and you won, like that was good news for your people, because if you lost a war, you were typically going to be enslaved or oppressed or conquered. But if you won a war, it's like, hey, this is good news. We won. We're the victors. We're free. And they didn't have the internet or phones back in the day, so when you won a military victory, you would have to send messengers out to all the cities and villages to announce to everybody, hey, we won. You would send these messengers out with the good news. And so these messengers were literally evangelists, because they were taking good news to all these cities. These messengers would go to the cities and they would shout, hey, I have good news. We've won. We're free. That's where the word comes from. And so this is the word that the earliest Christians used to talk about Jesus and Jesus' life. And actually later on, more specifically, they used the word to focus in on his death and resurrection. The Jesus life, beginning with his birth, but really culminating in his death and resurrection, is good news. And this angel here says, this is good news for all people. That today, in the city of David, Bethlehem, this Messiah has been born. And then the angel gives them all this detail. This is how you'll know who the Messiah is. This is what you'll find. You'll find this, and you'll find this, and you'll find that. And when you find that, that's how you'll know that this is that baby. And this baby is good news for everybody. Now, after this announcement is made from this angel, there's a whole army choir that shows up in the sky. And they start singing and they start praising God. So you have these shepherds who are out in the fields doing their job. It's nighttime, they're cold. Quite honestly, they're probably drinking and telling dirty jokes. And then these angels appear and they get this message of this baby that's been born. And then this sky lights up with this huge army choir and they're singing. And then the angels and the choir, they all disappear. And then you just have the shepherds that are left now with what they've just seen and what they've experienced. And here's what they decide to do. Here's their response to everything they've just witnessed. When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about. So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby who was lying in a manger. So after this whole thing happens, the shepherds look at each other and they're like, holy cow, that just happened. And then they have that question, what do we do? Because here's what I want you to notice. At no point, do these angels, do these messengers ever tell the shepherds what to do. You will get up and you will walk your stinky behind into town and you will find this person. No, all they do is tell them. Like, hey, here's what happened. If you want to go check it out, here's what to look for. So the shepherds aren't told, they're not commanded. It's just, hey, here's this good news. It's on you. And so now they kind of look at each other and they think, well, what should we do? See, the shepherds haven't been told, but what they have been is they have been invited. Hey, this great thing has happened, and we're inviting you to check it out if you want to. And if you go into town, here's what you need to look for, and when you find this, this is how you'll know that this is the baby. So the shepherds look at each other and think, well, we got to go. I mean, it's right here. It's in our town. Let's go do this. So they go into town, and they find the baby. What's interesting, N.T. Wright, who's like a biblical scholar, he points this out. N.T. Wright says, as people, it's funny in the Christmas story, we get so focused in on the details, like the swaddling clothes and the manger and all that. N.T. Wright says the only reason that stuff's even in the Christmas story is so that the shepherds will know when they've actually found the right baby. Like, it's all just peripheral details. It's like the shepherds get there, and it's essentially a checklist. Is this the place? Okay, is there a baby? Swaddling clothes? Check. Lying in a manger? Check. All right, this is it. Guys, I found it. That it's just, the point is not the swaddling clothes, the point is not the manger, the point is the baby, and all these other details are just there to make sure that this is the place. And so N.T. Wright's point, and I would say it's larger than just the biblical story, is sometimes within Christmas and really within other things, we get so focused on the details that we miss the point. Don't get lost in the details, remember the point. The point is that this baby has been born. And so the shepherds get there, and after making sure, yep, this it meets all the criteria. This is what we were told about. They have this experience with Jesus, and they're there with Mary and Joseph. And again, we don't know everything that happens in that moment. We don't know all what they're experiencing, but they're there. they've gone and they've checked this thing out, and now they've seen it for themselves. And so after they have this experience, and it's time for them to go back, time for them to kind of go back to their life, that they got, sheep that are out in the fields that hopefully haven't been eaten by wolves in their absence, and so they got to get back to that. But when they go back, once they leave their encounter with Jesus, once they go back, Luke says, here's what they do. Here's how they respond. When they'd seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child. So when they go back, they don't just go back with their heads down and their blinders on and just straight back to work. As they go back, they start telling other people. You'll never guess what happened. We were out there in the fields, and this thing happened, and then we went and we saw this baby, and it was incredible. Now, the fact that they're shepherds, I'm sure that there were some people in town that are going, yeah, you know what, you're probably just drunk, and you have no idea what you're talking about, you're just a shepherd. But I'm sure there's other people that's interesting. Because essentially the shepherds are doing for other people what the angels did for them. They're telling them, hey, here's what happened. Here's this experience that we had. I mean, if you want to check it out, it's like right around the corner. Here's what to look for. When you find this, that's how you'll know. And so the shepherds, yes, they go back to their life. They go back to what it is they were doing. But as they go back like inviting people into what it is that they have just experienced. And here's what I want to suggest to us. That I think that what the gospel writers, what they want us to do, what they want us to do as followers of Jesus, what they want us to do as a church, the way they want us to respond to the Christmas story is the way the shepherds did. But when you begin to talk about things like gospel and like evangelism, those things make us really, really nervous. And they make us really, really nervous for a lot of reasons, some of which I think are actually pretty good reasons. We don't, in our culture, in our world, even within the context of the church, we don't use the word evangelism very often anymore. When I was a kid in the 80s, we used evangelism all the time. I haven't heard it as much like in church circles as much anymore. The word gospel, you'll still hear in churches, you'll still hear people talk about it. But honestly, culturally, the word that I hear more than any of the others that comes out of this Greek word is the word evangelical. That's the word you'll hear that gets used in our culture all the time. Evangelicals. And evangelicals is kind of an interesting term. Historically, like if you look at what is an evangelical, the guy who's most famous for defining what an evangelical is a historian by the name of David Bebbington. And years ago, he kind of looked at it and he said, this is actually what defines an evangelical. Someone who would call themselves, someone who would be described, or even a church that would be described as an evangelical. And he came up with 4 categories. And he said, if these categories are true of you or your church, this is what makes you evangelical. And here's the categories he came up with. He said, first of all, evangelicals believe in some kind of conversion. Some kind of conversion experience where you had this experience with Jesus and you chose to follow him and your life changed and there was like some transformation. The word that gets quoted sometimes in this is like the word born again. Like you have this totally different kind of experience. So evangelicals, that's the first thing. The second thing is the Bible. That the Bible is this like authoritative place, is the word of God. That's a core belief within evangelical Christianity. The third one is the centrality of the cross. That the cross, Jesus' death on the cross and ultimately his resurrection, this is foundational. Like this is part of the center of your faith. And the last one is activism. That some religious traditions are more internally focused and it's not like they're not trying to do anything external, but Bebbington argued, he said, no, evangelicals kind of have this outward focus where they want more people to join their churches, they want more people to join their movement, they want to do things in the world, they want to do good, they kind of have this external focus. And so this is how Bebbington described what it is that makes someone or makes a church evangelical, and that if you follow into if all these things are true of you, then you would be a part of what's known, like culturally, as like evangelical Christianity. Now, that term in and of itself, and the way Bebbington describes it, it's like, oh, okay, that's not bad. That's okay, that's good. But the problem is, culturally, whenever you hear the word evangelical, this is typically not what it refers to. Because one of the places you'll hear the term evangelical a lot is if you watch the news. Because culturally, when you talk about evangelicals refer to one of two things. Evangelicals are either a voting bloc. That's the time you hear evangelical a lot, like election time. Like who's going to carry the evangelical vote? And evangelicals are just like this voting group of people that all vote the same way. The other time we refer to evangelicals is evangelicals are people that just knock on your door and try to convince you to believe what they believe. And so while historically you may have this definition of, hey, this is how, evangelical has been defined like kind of throughout history. But then you have this culturally, how we understand what it really means to be evangelical and how we use that word. And I know it could be really, really easy to kind of look at the cultural definition of evangelical and what it means and just to go, oh, well, that's a complete misunderstanding. That's a complete misunderstanding. That's really not what evangelical is. Not just a voting bloc. It's not like a political party. It's not just people who try to convince you of something. Let's get back to, this is really what evangelical is. And I understand that the way our culture, the way by and large that term evangelical and even other terms then related to it, like evangelism or gospel, the way they're understood is like, it's a misrepresentation. Like that's not really, really what it is. It's really something different. And I understand that in some ways may be an unfair criticism, but here's what I want to propose. I believe the cultural kind of definition of evangelical and what it is, I do think that criticism has some merit. I do think the way that most people understand like this thing that is evangelical Christianity or these movements or these churches that have been a part of what it like this is evangelical Christianity, I think people's understanding and really like negative views of evangelism and evangelical and gospel, I think they are rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of really what gospel and evangelism is really all about. And I don't think the misunderstanding is on other people's parts. I think it's on our part. I think when you look within the church, when you look within Christian faith in our culture, when you look into what has been historically known, again, as evangelicalism within this country, I think we have this misunderstanding of what evangelism really is. And that, in large part, has led to how other people understand. Because here's what I want to argue. I think our understanding of evangelism is incomplete. I think it's incomplete. I think it has been really for at least most of my lifetime, if not longer. When I was, years ago, I was studying in college, I was doing my master's degree, and I took this class on world religions. And we studied all of these different religions of the world, and you had to do some projects throughout the semester that involved doing research about other religious traditions, which included going to a service or a gathering. And so we didn't have kids at the time, and my wife was really cool, and she'd come with me so that I didn't have to go alone, because it's, if you're a visitor here, you know that. Like, it's kind of intimidating to go into a religious gathering that you're kind of an outsider of or you're new. And so one of the religious traditions that I researched was Islam. And so I went to a mosque that was here in Orange County, and I had called them ahead of time because I didn't know much about it. I knew the service was Friday afternoon, but I didn't know, like, how should I dress? I didn't want anyone to, like, feel threatened. I didn't want to be, like, an awkward thing. So I just called him and said, hey, is it okay if I come? Is this a good time to come? And the guy that I talked to was super cool, and he, like, walked me through everything. And he even, when Linda and I went, he met us out front and, like, gave us a tour and walked us through and kind of explained everything. It was really neat. It was a neat experience. But I remember when it came time to go in for the actual service, Linda went upstairs where the ladies were, and then I went downstairs where the guys were. And I got there early because I didn't want to walk in late. And so I got there early, and when I walked in, there wasn't very many people there. They were kind of spread out all over the place. It was a pretty good-sized room, but there was only a few people in there. And so I go in, and I sit down, and I was just like, I'm just going to wait here, and when it starts, it'll start. But after sitting there for a couple minutes, there's these two guys who are kind of sitting behind me toward the back, and one of them calls out to me. He goes, hey, you. And I kind of turn, and I'm looking around. I'm like really the only one over in that direction. I go, are you talking to me? He goes, yeah, you. Come here. So I thought, okay. So I stood up, and I walked back over there to these two older guys, and they introduced themselves to me, and I introduced myself to them, and we just started talking. And they asked me, what I was doing there, and I kind of explained to them. I explained to them who I was and my background, and at the time I was a youth pastor, and then I worked at a church, and we got in had a really cool conversation. And we were talking about ourselves, our own stories. We were talking about faith. We were talking about, kind of the differences in our faith. And I'll never forget, like, the heart of the conversation was one of the guys asked me a question that really kind of threw me. Not because I was offended or anything by it. It's just a question no one had ever asked me. This guy looks at me as we're in the middle of this conversation, and he goes, hey, did Jesus ever go to the bathroom? And when he asked it, I was like, again, I wasn't, like, offended. I wasn't upset. It's just not a question anyone had ever asked me. And so I was like, what? Like, out of confusion, he goes, did Jesus ever go to the bathroom? And I thought about it for a minute, and I'm trying to think, like, how should I answer this? How should I answer this? And I looked back at the guy, and I was like, well, I can't prove that he went to the bathroom. Like, it's not in there, like, Luke chapter 6, and after Jesus healed a blind man, he went pee. Like, there's no chapter and verse of, like, Jesus went to the bathroom. So I looked at the guy and said, I can't prove it. There's no, like, textual evidence. But yes, I believe Jesus went to the bathroom. I mean, yes, he was God. He was also a human being. But as a human being, you have to go to the bathroom. So yes, I think Jesus went to the bathroom. The guy goes, see, that's why he can't be God. God doesn't go to the bathroom. And it was just kind of an interesting dialogue of his understanding of the nature of God and who God was and what it meant to be God. It was really fascinating. So we were talking, and then the service started, and so we participated in the service, and that was kind of neat to be there. And then after the service was over, we talked for a few more minutes, and we're walking out. I'm going to the place where I'll meet Linda again. And as we're getting out there, there's like a little bookstore set up. And the guy looks at me and says, hey, do you have a copy of the Quran? I said, no, I don't have a copy of the Quran at all. He goes, okay. And he took out his wallet, and he put some money down on the desk, and he picked up a copy of the Quran, and he handed it to me. And then he looked at me, and he goes, hey, I've told you everything I can tell you. Now it's between you and God. Good luck. And he got in his car, and he left. Never saw him again. Never talked to him again. That was it. He had done what he needed to do. He had told me what he needed to tell me. And now, whatever happened in my life, whatever happened in my future, whatever happened in the next life, was between me and God. See, I would argue that within the Christian tradition, that's exactly how we understand and how we have practiced evangelism. That it is me telling you this information. Here's what you need to know. Jesus came down on the cross. He died for you and your sins. You can accept that and go to heaven. You can reject that and go to hell. Good luck. Like that's what it's this transactional thing where I'm giving you this information. Here's this information. Now that you have it, it's up to you. Good luck. I hope you do something with it. And here's the thing, like with that guy, what that guy did was rooted in respect and love. I was not at all offended. I was not at all upset. Like, he was super nice to me, made my experience there really, really enjoyable. And so even within the Christian tradition, even when we do that, even when we just, hey, I'm telling you, here's what happened, here's what you need to know, here's the information you need to know, and then we walk away, I think it's rooted in a good, like we genuinely want what's best for people. The problem is, that's not the full understanding of really what evangelism or gospel is all about. That it's not transactional, it's not me telling you information, there's more to it than that. If you look at the book of John, which is John's account of the life of Jesus, and John talks about how the Jesus movement like first starts to take off, like from its very origins. Like when Jesus gets his first followers, it starts when Jesus goes to this guy named John the Baptist. And when John the Baptist sees Jesus, John the Baptist looks at him and says, that's the guy. The phrase that John the Baptist uses is he says, there's the Lamb of God. That's him. That's the Messiah. That's the one that God is going to send to make everything right. Now, there's a bunch of people around when John says this, and a few of these people, one of whom is named Andrew, starts following Jesus around. And when I say following Jesus, I mean that like he physically just starts following him. Like Jesus is walking and Andrew's right behind him. And Jesus is looking back, what? Finally, Jesus turns around and goes, can I help you? Like, what do you want? And Andrew's response, he looks at him and he says, where are you staying? And here's what Jesus says. Here's how Jesus responds to that question. Come, he replied, and you will see. So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. So Andrew, based solely on John the Baptist, John the Baptist is like, dude, there's the guy. Andrew starts physically following him. Jesus, what do you want? Where are you staying? And Jesus at that point, like, he doesn't ask for buy-in. He doesn't ask for commitment. He just says, why don't you come and hang out with me? You can come and see where I'm staying. You can come see what kind of I'm all about. And let's just hang out and let's get to know each other. Now, after Andrew spends this day with Jesus, after he spends his time with Jesus, the first thing he does is he goes out and finds his brother, a guy by the name of Simon. And here's what Andrew says to Simon, right, when he finds him. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we found the Messiah, that is the Christ, and he brought him to Jesus. So after Andrew spends his time with Jesus, Andrew goes out and finds his brother Simon. He's like, dude, you got to come here. Like, we found the guy. The Messiah, the Christ, the one that God's going to send to make everything right. We found him. And then he literally grabs him by the wrist and drags him. Dude, come hang out with this guy. Super cool. And so he brings him over there. And now Andrew's there with Simon, and they're all now hanging out with Jesus. And again, there's no commitment. Andrew doesn't look at Simon and say, you better believe. He just says, come and see. Now, there are other people that are part of that kind of like initial hanging out with Jesus. And one of them is a guy named Philip. And Philip is there, and Philip hangs out with Jesus. And after Philip hangs out with Jesus, he goes off to his friend Nathanael. And here's what Philip says. Here's what Philip does. Philip found Nathanael and told him, we found the one that Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And then Nathanael doesn't really have a high view of Nazareth, because his response is, Nazareth, can anything good come from there? Nathanael asked, come and see, said Philip. And so Philip goes off to Nathanael. He's like, dude, we found him. This is the guy. This is the one Moses talked about a long time ago. This is the one that God was going to send to make everything right. It's Jesus. He's from Nazareth. Nathanael's like, Nazareth is ghetto. Like, nothing good comes out of Nazareth. And Philip's response is, dude, just come and see. He doesn't sit there and like try to convince him or argue with him like, here's 8 points of why something good. He just says, just come and see. And so what's interesting is you look at like, according to John, how like the Jesus movement first begins to build steam. It's with other people inviting their friends to come with them arm in arm and hand in hand. They're not telling them to do anything. They're not telling them to believe anything. They're not telling them to accept anything. They're literally telling them, I experienced something, and I want you to come with me and to experience it. And they go with them arm in arm. Now, this is important. All of those things do begin with an announcement. There's an announcement. Hey, we found him. Hey, there's a guy. Hey, he's really cool. There is an announcement, but that announcement is followed up with, come with me. That announcement isn't, hey, we found a guy, you should go check him out or you're going to burn in hell. That's not the follow. The follow-up is, hey, I found this great thing. I had this great experience. Why don't you come with me? I want to go with you arm in arm, side by side, so we can experience this thing together. Yes, it's this announcement of this good news. But then it's this invitation to join me. And let's do this together. See, even if you go back to the shepherds, look at how the shepherds are. I mean, look at how when the angels first show up to the shepherds, what do? They give them that, hey, I have good news. The Messiah has been born. And you're invited to check it out. And even as the shepherds make their way through the streets, and they're telling people, they're inviting people, hey, you can go check it out. And here's the thing about the way the shepherds respond, and here's the thing about the way that Andrew and Simon and Philip and Nathanael and all these people respond. All of their responses are rooted in joy and in awe and wonder. When I was a kid, like in the 80s, like the predominant method of evangelism within churches at that time was this thing known as Evangelism Explosion. And maybe some of you heard it, maybe some of you not, but it was this program where literally you would go door to door and knock on people's door to share with them the gospel, the good news of Jesus. And Evangelism Explosion began with one question. You literally knock on someone's door, hey, how you doing this evening? Hey, if you were to die tonight, do you know if you'd go to heaven or hell? Which is like, I don't know, if you knock on my door and ask me that question, it's like, I don't know, I'm watching the football game. Like it's kind of a weird question. But if you think about that question is rooted in fear. Because the whole thing about Evangelism Explosion is you ask that question, then based on the person's response, you ask another question, you ask another question. But it's all this rooted in fear. Like, if you die tonight, do you know where you're going to go? If you look at the way the shepherds respond, if you look at the way Andrew responds and Philip responds, it's not rooted in fear. It's rooted in this like sense of awe and wonder for this encounter that they've had with God. Like, dude, I experienced this great thing. Come back with me. Let's experience it together. They didn't keep it to themselves. It wasn't just about them, but it also wasn't flung on other people in fear. It was shared out of this sense of joy and gratitude. And it was this invitation to, hey, do this with me. I think one of the reasons that we are so afraid of like sharing our faith with other people, I know when I was growing up and I would go to church, they'd be like, you need to evangelize. I used to get so scared because like I always thought to myself, like, I don't know what to say. And what if they ask questions that I don't know the answer to, and I don't know a lot of things about the Bible, like I don't know a lot of Bible facts. What if they ask questions about the Bible that I can't answer? And so it's like overwhelming to like think like, what do I say to someone? How do I really share my faith with someone? And let me just tell you, like, as someone who like I have degrees in ministry, theology, I still don't know what to say to people. Like I still don't have all the answers. Like people ask questions like, this is a really good question. Give me a week and I'll try to get back to you and see if like, you're never going to know all the answers, but the whole point of the gospel, the whole point of evangelism, the way the shepherds understood it, the way the earliest followers of Jesus understood it, was not to stand up and give a 12-point defense of this is why Christianity is the best option. I'm not saying there's no place for that. I'm not saying that's not important. But what I'm saying is evangelism begins when we just look at someone else and say, man, here's this experience that I had. And I would love for you to come with me. I would love for you to share in that experience with me. This is why, like, when you invite someone to church, because, like, church is this place where we gather to, like, be in the presence of God and in the presence of Jesus, and it's this place we gather to, like, study and learn and grow, and it's this place that we gather really to experience God through His presence and His Spirit. When we invite people to church, our invitation to church should never be just, hey, you need to go. See, the reason that we exist as a church, the reason that I have chosen to dedicate my life to being a pastor is because I believe that Jesus Christ is the hope of the world. Because in Jesus and in Jesus alone, there is life and there is grace and there is forgiveness and there is restoration and there is healing and there's a future. And our world needs that now more than ever. And I guarantee if you look around your life, you know people. And maybe some of us, in fact, not maybe, some of us in here, man, we're broken and we're hurting and we feel like we're lost and we need grace and we need forgiveness and we need to know that we're loved and we need to know that we matter and we need to know that we can have a future and there is restoration. We need that. We need what only Jesus can offer. But evangelism isn't going up to someone and saying, hey, I'm sorry your life sucks, you should go to church. That's not evangelism. That's not the gospel. The gospel is going up to someone and saying, hey, man, I've had this experience with Jesus. And man, it changed so much for me. And this is my opinion here at this point. Here's how every invitation to church should ever be worded. Come sit with me. I'm not telling you to go do something. I'm not piling more on you. I'm not trying to guilt you. I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm not trying to convince you. I'm simply inviting you. Come experience this with me. Let's experience this together. Because this is how the shepherds did it. This is how Andrew and Philip and the earliest followers of Jesus did it. See, this I would argue, this is like the holistic understanding of evangelism. Evangelism isn't just telling someone to do something. It's not just transactional. It's not just let me share with you a piece of information. It's rooted in this, let me share with you a little bit of my life. Let me share with you this experience that I've had. Let me share with you what God has done in my life. And then I want to invite you to experience that with me. To come with me, to stand with me, arm in arm and side by side. Because the thing about faith is never just an individualistic thing. It's not. It's never just about me. It's always about us. It's always about the community. It's always about the people around us. And man, if we know people that need Jesus, we know people that need grace and need forgiveness and need healing, what they don't need is us to tack one more thing on their list for them to do. You got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this, and you got to go to church. Don't forget. No, what they need is for us to come alongside them and say, hey, I love you. I care about you. Let's do this together. I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm not commanding you to do anything. I can't answer all your questions. But let's do this together, side by side and arm in arm. That's how the early church evangelized. The gospel wasn't just this piece of information. It was relational. It was about us together as people experiencing God together. See, our church, our world needs the gospel. Our world needs evangelists. But our world needs people who understand that, that evangelism and the gospel are all-encompassing. They're not transactional. They're relational. It's not an argument. It's not a command. It's an invitation to share our experiences and our lives in the presence of Jesus. That's what I think our response to Christmas should be. That's how we should respond to the story. I think that's what the gospel writers want us to do. They want us to do what the shepherds did. To go back home to our lives, to our jobs, sharing with people, and inviting them arm in arm, hand in hand, to experience that with us. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love for us, that you came down to this earth for us, to make this world right, to bring reconciliation and grace and forgiveness. And Father, I thank you that your life, and specifically your death and resurrection, are good news. It is the good news that the world needs, that there is hope, that there can be a future, that the future can be better, that there is life beyond death. But God, our world also needs to hear that in a way that is loving. God, I don't blame anyone. I think, churches have done and Christians have done what they've done for a long time out of a good place, that we wanted people to know, we wanted people to hear. But God, in some ways, I think we've been at times our own worst enemy. And Father, what our world needs is not more people shouting at them and telling them what to do. What our world needs is people who will come alongside and who will listen and who will talk and who will share and who will stand arm in arm with each other. God, that's where evangelism happens. That's where the gospel gets shared. I mean, big crusades, those are great, and I'm not knocking those at all, but the heart of evangelism isn't a big crusade. It's one person talking to another person, saying, look what I experienced. Why don't you come with me? God, help us to be a place. Help us to be a church that lives that gospel, that lives that good news. God, we all know people in our life that need hope. And God, maybe this Christmas season is a perfect time to do that. So help us to be people and help us to be a church that understands that the way the gospel is shared is one person at a time. Father, we love you. We want to honor you in everything we do. And so we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.